ecological economics and what he considers to be the misconceptions of interpretations around the work of Herbert Simon. So I'm going to hand over to you, Gerd. Can I just remind everybody, if you're joining now, could you please mute yourself until it's time for questions, because otherwise we get some background noise. Okay, so Irina's just told me that she is recording, Gerd, so I don't know whether you want to keep that in mind, but Irina is able to record this session after all. So hand over to you, Gerd. Thank you very much for leading today's discussion.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I will talk today about from bounded rationality to ecological rationality. So bounded rationality is the concept coined by Herbert Simon. It has actually three different meanings. The one by Herbert Simon himself, and two interpretations he did not agree with. The first is that bounded rationality is optimization under constraints. So I brought you a quote from Herbert Simon where he considered suing authors who misuse his concepts for an optimization models. Actually, optimization was where he wanted to have an alternative for. The second misconception is that bounded rationality is irrationality. And here's another quote. And in both of these misunderstandings, they assume that the yardstick would be an optimization model, particularly maximization for expected utility theory. And so to understand Simon, it is useful to look first what he meant with bounded rationality, given there's so much confusion about it. And then I will go from there and explain how we developed bounded rationality into ecological rationality. One reason why we use a different term is because of the confusion of bounded rationality with either optimization under constraints or irrationality. So Simon's bounded rationality has three principles. The first one is model actual decision processes, not as if utility maximization. The second one is model decisions under uncertainty, not only under risk. And the third one is model the match of process, such as strategies or heuristics, to the environment. Because the term uncertainty is so often used in so many different ways, I dwell a moment into defining what the concepts mean. I use Savage's concept of a small world. A small world is a world where one knows all possible future states. So the agent knows the exhaustive and mutually exclusive set of future states of the world, and also the exhaustive and mutually exclusive set of consequences of their actions in given states. So the pair S and C is a small world. And a small world with unknown probabilities is called ambiguity. One with known probabilities is risk. And when I talk about uncertainty, I mean situations that are not small worlds, that is, where the state space is not perfectly known or cannot be known, as in most situations, such as investment, such as running your personal life, and most business situations. So let me give an overview about the research program. The research program has a descriptive component. So what's in the adaptive toolbox of an individual or an institution? So what are heuristics they use, the building blocks, and the evolved capacities they exploit? I will give you a few examples. The second question is new. It's a prescriptive question. So can we show, given a heuristic, in what environments will it fail and will it succeed? So the ecological rationality is different from logical rationality. So much, even most of economic rationality, so at least that part of rationality that focuses on expected utility maximization, the axioms or Bayesian updating, is about consistency. ecological rationality is not about consistency, but about success in the world. And the adaptive toolbox is an empirical, experimental program. Ecological rationality is a mathematical program where you prove, for instance, that under certain situations, one reason, a heuristic that just relies on one reason, is as good as any linear model, and faster and more frugal. And intuitive design is the application of these principles to help institutions make better decisions. For instance, I've been working with the Bank of England to design fast and frugal trees for identifying banks in problem or greenwashing banks. So here's an example of a one reason heuristic. So how to hire the best people? And that's a problem of uncertainty. It's not a problem of risk. And Elon Musk, when he was young and Tesla was young, reported that he has been using a one reason heuristic. Does this person, the candidate who applied, possess some exceptional ability? If no, no hire. If yes, hire. How to find out? So he reported that he interviewed the problems, the candidates, and let them tell some of their most difficult problems they worked on, how they solved them. And he was relying on, again, on another single Q heuristic in order to find out whether they tell the truth, which is the detailedness of the report of the account. And actually, according to a study that's coming out in Human Nature in the next months, people can hardly tell truth from lies in videotaped interviews, but the moment they're told, look at detailedness, they can't do it. So here is an example. So that's the part about how do people, here's just one example, make important decisions under uncertainty. Ecological rationality is the question, when is data reasonable heuristic and when it's not? Note that the program that has shaped much of behavioral economics, the heuristics and biases program, never asks these questions because it's already assumed that if you just look at one thing, it can't really not be a good idea. No, we want to ask here an empirical question. And I'll give you just one result about ecological rationality that not only applies to Musk's hiring heuristic, but to any type of one reason decision-making heuristics. And so the question is, can we identify a structure in the world where one reason is as good as having, say, a logistic regression with many, many reasons? And here, the dominant Q condition formalizes such a situation. So in this case, you have 5 Qs. And if the weights of these Qs, and they're all binary to make it simple, form a dominant Q structure, and that's defined in the way that the weight of the first Q is larger than the sum of the weight of the other Qs, then no linear model can make better predictions than a one reason heuristic. And the weights here are the additional weight, like beta weights in a logistic regression, not the individual weights, so the additional contributions. I think that's very intuitive to see. Similar conditions have been shown if you have a different task, like compare 2 options, and as in take the best, and then the conditions are slightly modified, but I'm not going into this. So second example for a class of heuristic. The first one was this one reason decision-making with one clever Q. Here, I have brought as illustration Jeff Bezos' way, according to himself, how he made the decision when Amazon was still a small company. Interestingly, Bezos reports he used the same cue as Musk. Does this person possess some exceptionability? But it wasn't enough if the answer was yes. He had two more questions. Will you admire that person? Which was important for Bezos because you thought he can learn something. And that's also not enough. And a second question, so will this person raise the average level of effectiveness? Only if that also is yes, higher. This type of heuristic is a fast frugal tree. A fast and frugal tree is defined as an incomplete tree that has an exit on each of the questions. So the first question can already determine. That's also non-compensatory, and you can see that you can't map this type of heuristics into a utility function. But that shouldn't be the criterion of rationality. So here I illustrate how one can analyze fast and frugal trees. Now, in a decision, you can make two errors: false alarms. So to make an offer to someone, in this case, who will turn out not to be the right person, or misses. So not making an offer to an ideal candidate. And Bezos tree is on the left here. And so that minimizes false positives. And one can construct with the same cues and the same order of cues here 4 different cues. And you can see the farther you shift to the right, they minimize misses. So they're higher, 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 and minimize at the cost of false alarms and the other way around. So here's a way one can construct the trees, and one can also understand why certain agencies, their heuristic go in one direction. It's just an illustration of our work with the Bank of England. I'm not going into detail. The question is, how do I identify banks that are in trouble? And it's again 3 questions, and there's a red flag, and a red flag, and a red flag on every one of them. And that you can just think a moment, does it minimize misses or does it minimize false alarms? So if you red flag, then you increase the false alarms, but you minimize misses. If you're interested in how to build fast and frugal trees in real world problems in the wild, and it's a classification thing, this book is a hands-on book, and it also compares the building heuristic with building machine learning models and the performance between the two. And it analyzes when complex machine learning models do better than simple heuristics and when the opposite is the case. It's also a book about psychological AI. So how to use insights from psychology to make algorithms smart. And most of machine learning is today based on the idea that psychology doesn't matter, but that, I should give you one example later. A fruitful connection would be much better. Here's an example. Remember Google flu trends. The question was, how can I predict the flu-related doctor visits, so the spread of the flu next week, for instance? And Google engineers, they used 50 million of search queries and identified 45 features to include in the model. The model is secret, but it's probably nothing but a linear model. And it made predictions. So that's one way to go. And when the model failed, when something unexpected came, then they made it more complex. The alternative to this is to realize that's a situation of uncertainty where we make predictions. Flu viruses like coronavirus are highly variable, and it's very hard to make any prediction very far. So the human mind in that situations does forget. And recency is one of the principles well studied in memory research, which is a systematic, not a random, forgetting. And we used what we call the recency heuristic, which is the most extreme version of forgetting. You only take the last data point you have and ignore everything before. So simply predict that this week's proportion of flu-related doctor visits equals the proportion of the most recent past week. So that's an example for a simple example for psychological AI. You don't just run machine learning models, but you think about how the human mind solves this problem. And what you see here is an analysis we did over the entire 8 years where Google Flu Trends was out. And the I just note you here between 2009 and 2010. This is where the swine flu hit. The red curve are the predictions of Google Flu Trends. Google Flu Trends learned from big data that the flu is high in the winter, low in the summer, and swine flu hit in the summer. So it underestimated, and the engineers couldn't stop it from underestimating and did an update. And that's the update where they made the model more complex instead of more simple. And here's the simplest model of all, and it predicts over the entire year and for every year better than Google Flu Trends. And on average, you see it here, the error is about half. The error is measured on that scale here, on the y-axis. So what do we have here? An example for less can be more under uncertainty, not under risk. Yeah? And also that we still have an attitude in much of machine learning that the more information you use, the better. That's not true. So why is this not true? I'll show you one general principle. So why do people use heuristics? And the most common account for that is, and I will in a minute explain why it's not correct, is the accuracy effort trade-off. The assumption of a general accuracy effort trade-off means that simple heuristics, they reduce the effort, but that I have to pay a price for that, namely a loss of accuracy. And the underlying philosophy is the decomposition of total error into bias and noise. And here it seems to be that the only problem is to reduce the bias. Noise is here something you can't reduce. So that principle, the accuracy effort trade-off, is true in a small world. It is not true in a world of uncertainty. In a world of uncertainty, where you have to estimate and not knowing parameters, the total error decomposition is different. It's bias, but also variance and noise. So to make it short, variance is basically what you produce by overfitting your parameters. So variance increases the more free parameters you have. It decreases with the sample size. That's all well known. But the point here is, in order to make good predictions, you should not reduce bias to zero. You need a balance between variance and bias. Heuristics that rely only on one reason, that's often fixed, and not is, they do not produce error by variance, only by bias. And the balance between two tells you when a heuristic that is fast and frugal will actually, in addition, predict better than a more complex model, and when this will not happen. That's the important insight. So let me round up. The serious study of heuristics, so decision-making under uncertainty, needs formal models of heuristic, otherwise you can't even start. We do not need vague levels such as system 1. I'm personally not happy that we are ending up with vague dichotomies where we can have precise models of heuristics. So Tversky's elimination by aspect was a precise model. Terms such as availability or not. Competitive testing, that means we need to pin the models we have or against the best competitors, such as the example I gave you. So Google flu trends secret algorithm against a recency heuristic. The recency heuristic is also listed among the list of biases and fallacies. That's an error. Recency heuristic can go wrong, it can go right. The real question is, can we identify the environments where it is more likely to do better than big data? And you've seen one example where one data can lead to better prediction than big data. And finally, we need to have tests of predictive power. In much of economics, including behavioral economics, we still fit our models to data. And then you get the more free parameters you have, the better the fit. But that's a mathematical truth. It doesn't tell you very much about the model of your data. We need to do out-of-sample prediction and better out-of-population prediction, so real prediction in the future. And that was done in the case of Google flu trends. And I end with 3 misconceptions. Rationality in the real world is maximization of expected utility. No, you're not getting far with that. People use heuristics because they're lazy and irrational. No, people use heuristic because in most situations, optimization is not feasible. And in situations where they're ecological rational, that's the only question. Whether a heuristic is used in situations that are ecological rational or in others. And finally, more information and more computation is always better. No, that only holds in a small world where everything is certain and known, but not in general. So I think we should dare to study Homo heuristicus. It's an alternative to Homo economicus. And most Homo economic models are in small worlds. And Homo economicus lives in a world of uncertainty. That's not the same as in risk. Decision-making under risk requires logic and statistic, but that's not enough under uncertainty. Logical rationality is not the same as ecological rationality. Under uncertainty, less can be more, and that can be modeled by the bias-variance dilemma, not by the accuracy effort trade-off. And after all, if you would live in a world where everything is known and predictable, as Frank Knight already said, there would be no profit. And there would be also not much psychology needed, and intelligent innovation would have not evolved. And finally, if you want to, I'll just add, if you want to use these insights for constructing AI algorithms, I've just published a book that does this in more detail, and it works by the stable world principle. That's a similar distinction to risk versus uncertainty, and addresses this question: why can AI win a chess but not predict the flu? And the reason is, here we have uncertainty, there we have well-defined problems, and algorithms are great in much better than we in a well-defined problem. In other words, if we want to use AI and get the best out of it, then we need to change the world, including us. That's the reason why there won't be self-driving cars level 5, but level 4. That will likely happen. That means we will have to change our cities and also prevent people from driving. And finally, the similar question, is more data always better? In uncertain situation, that's not the case. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Gerd. That's great. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so hand it over to you all now for questions, comments. If you want to indicate whether you want to answer a question, could you put up your little virtual hand? That's easy for me then to see. And I'll just take questions in comments in order. Kristen, you're first then.
Start off the new year with a question. I don't know. So my question is, do you see these predictive models that you were discussing as being more useful or valuable in certain circumstances? Because you talk about hiring with Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, and then you have the financial situations. Now with hiring to determine whether it was the right decision, I mean, there's a question of whether a question of time and not being able to compare it to the other employees versus a bank failing or not failing. It's a fairly dichotomous decision. You can look at it just at one bank. So I was wondering your thoughts on that.
So the both decisions are decisions under uncertainty. And we can now spell out uncertainty. I was a little bit brief just to get some ideas over. And in the case of banks, it's high volatility. And as you know, like the Bank of England or the Bundesbank, which I also work, their models are risk models. So in the sense I made, it's standard probability theory, value at risk. Have you ever computed the value of risk? So good luck. You have thousands of risk factors, and they are not independent. At least a big bank has thousands of risk factors. So you have to estimate a matrix in the millions of covariances. And that's what I mean with good luck. There's no way. You will incur so much error by estimation that it's useless. But that's on which Basel 2 and 3 are built on. So the frameworks. So the Bank of England is the only one, and now some of their colleagues went to the Bundesbank after Brexit, who have this insight. The others, they just think it's more is better. So we need a serious study of how can we develop simple, robust heuristic and find, it can't be too simple, it must be something in between. And that's what the bias variance dilemma tells you. Something which has enough bias, but protects us against the other errors, just to overfit immensely. And that's the real challenge. We just need more people who work on these problems. And there are too few, because there's still this optimization illusion. And also, as I mentioned before, I would love to see behavioral economics moving to deal with uncertainty and take heuristics seriously, rather than looking down at them and pretending that we know for everything the right answer. And if you have a different one, the blame is on you, never on the theory.
Understand. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think on that, I mean, I'm going to let Multi come in, but I think that there are, well, maybe this is just my sort of perspective, but I think that there are a few and probably an increasing number of people that classify themselves as behavioral economists that, you know, in recent years are starting to take the heuristics as not necessarily errors in human judgment. So there might be some moves in that direction, Gerd, I think. Multi.
Yeah, that's true. I just want to see more.
Okay, Multi.
Yeah, hello from California. I have a very big picture question in a way that popped into my mind when I saw your last slide. The last slide you said, you know, that the AI principle, basically, and algorithms, they change us and our values, right? And I think there's a huge discussion about that, and an important discussion. Now, I was wondering, you know, in your long experience on heuristics, and how far do actually the systematic application of heuristics change us and our values? And where I'm coming from with my question is sort of course, heuristics in a complex world blend out deliberately certain features of a complex world, right? If I do this now systematically, I could see how we as a society, us as individuals, we also change, right? For example, we might make less errors, but we might also be less prone to be exposed to some form of diversity, let's say. Now, I understand that it's a lot about the predictive power of, your model, etc., that counts. But I think there is maybe a performative aspect of the application of heuristics on individuals' values. So I was wondering whether that's something that you think is a point, or you think it's actually not really a point.
I'm not sure whether I understood it, yeah, but the it's about, your question is about the adaptation. So the first human being, you seem to have a baby in front of you.
That's correct.
A baby is just heuristics from all the way down, reacting on environmental cues that are probably to a large degree evolutionary built, at least first, and then all it starts learning. So the ecological rationality is the study of the adaptation of heuristics to environments. And that, if your question is that sometimes that the use of heuristic goes wrong, yes, of course. So does the use of optimization models. For instance, one of the reasons why we had the financial crisis of 2008 is the blind trust in financial models that are optimization models. And we need to learn to distinguish between certain of situations of certainty, like risk or ambiguity, and situations of uncertainty, and study how we function and how politicians function. And it's mostly heuristics the entire way down. If I missed, come again.
I think I probably didn't express myself clearly enough. When I was coming from is sort of one critique of nudging, right, would be, hey, nudges are not just helping us make better decisions, but they actually, by highlighting certain features in the decision environment, shape also what we want. You know, and that could be one critique of nudges. Now, can the application of heuristics by, let's say, us now redesigning the medical decision-making context or the consumer in a consumer protection context, by basically implementing that heuristics in the decision environment, we actually also shape the values of the people that we want the heuristics to apply. Now, I know it, you know, on average, they might make better decisions, but we also have sort of that feedback on people's values.
Yeah. So as to nudging, so I would rather bet on making people smart rather than nudging. Nudging is, now, I'm aware that some people now use the term nudging for everything. And that's not helpful. Nudging has a very precise and original definition, namely that you exploit people's cognitive biases in order to lead them where at least you think they want to be. And that's very different from anything that's called education or making people strong. And heuristics, this systematic teaching of heuristics helps to make people strong. And in that way, so for instance, in situations of uncertainty, I've learned one thing from my my work in decision making, that you make decisions faster, because there is anyhow you mostly know only afterwards whether it was a good one, and certain heuristics can be very helpful in this way.
Thank you.
I think that, yeah, I think that's okay. Nick.
So very interesting presentation as ever, Gerd, and I'm very sympathetic to lots of the points you're making. I'm intrigued as to quite how broadly you're interpreting heuristic here. So you mentioned that babies can be viewed as a collection of heuristics, as it were, all the way down. And that seems quite a strong thing to say if you have quite a narrow interpretation of what a heuristic is. So to take something much simpler than a baby, you might take an AI system like the of the moment GPT-3, which obviously does this amazing text processing. Now, you know, is it just a matter of terminology? Is that heuristics all the way down? It's fantastic. It doesn't have a model of the world. Obviously, it doesn't have a there's no Bayesian or any other analysis going on. It's not how it works. Does it have a model? Is it a heuristic system or not?
So you put your finger on a difficult point of definition. So when does it end, when it's not? So I would say GPT-3 is not a good example for a heuristic. It basically, it's a text prediction model, and it basically uses tons and tons and tons of data to associate things. The human mind functions very different, as you well know. Yeah? We learn by one instance, and to figure out how the human mind does things that current machine learning techniques can't do, that I think is a key question. And heuristics are probably one answer to this, but I wouldn't say that's the entire answer.
So just a quick follow-up on that, so that's very useful. Another perspective on heuristics might be that they're sort of the outcome of cognition. So they're, rather than thinking that they're building blocks, they're kind of things that we create in the moment in a creative way. So you might think, for example, think about the case of disease prediction. If you're thinking about COVID, a while ago we could see COVID starting in China, and people thinking about this might think, oh, this might spread to other countries which are connected to China, and we can see that it pops up in Italy, and then you might think, oh, it's going to be growing fast in other parts of Europe. But you wouldn't get that from what was going on last week, because the levels of COVID in many countries last week was nil. But you'd know it's coming because you have this intuitive model of the causality. So you might. So I'm absolutely by the idea that we're not predicting the spread of COVID in that early phase by having some kind of complete probabilistic model of the world that's going to be completely causal. Of course, we have no idea how to model it. But I would have thought that the process that we're going through is trying to create heuristic models. We're saying things like, well, if it's like that in Italy now, in 3 weeks it's going to be like that in the UK, because that's how long it took to get from China to Italy, or something crude like that. And you might look at that and say, that's a heuristic. But it seems like the secret of intelligence is the ability to create these heuristics. It's not, once you've got them, they look very simple, but the situation is continually requiring you to reshape the heuristic based on basically what the world is throwing at you. So I suppose I'm just wondering about the tension between saying, well, the mind just consists of a bunch of heuristics, and that's what intelligence is, versus the viewpoint where you say intelligence is a process which is not itself heuristic, although it might be to some extent, but its output is the creation of these heuristic models, which are they're sort of clever and cleverly were adapted to the problem of interest, but they're continually shifting, and when the world changes, you suddenly think, oh, we've locked down, and then suddenly, I changed my heuristic. I don't expect transfer of COVID from one country to another, because I just have this heuristic which says, well, it can't move around now. But that's not in any given fixed model.
So you're right saying that so I would say, if you ask me, how does intelligence relate to the adaptive toolbox? I would say it's certainly using a heuristic, simple. You don't need much intelligence for that. But to choose a heuristic from the adaptive toolbox that is ecologically rational in the situation you face, that's what I think intelligence is. And another aspect of intelligence you mentioned is to develop heuristics in the first place. And that goes most likely by imitation, another heuristic process. So much of social processes are part in learning heuristics, and it could also go in part by individual learning. And certain the heuristics they exploit core capacities, like of human memory, for instance, recognition heuristic, or even imitation. So many species can do this as generally as we can do. So yes, intelligence would be then the rational use of heuristics and its development.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Much enjoyed that, and in fact, I have a question which actually is, I think, a sort of concrete version of the last one from Nick, actually, which is, I was very taken by your example of the Bank of England using heuristics as regulatory devices, and the question I had is how you think then about the activity of banks trying to game those heuristics.
Yeah.
And is that a battle of heuristics, or exactly how do you conceive of it?
That's a good point. Yeah. When I talk to, for instance, to the European Central Bank, so that is always brought as the first argument against any change. So change from the optimization models to heuristics. And now there's an easy answer to this. Think about value at risk. As I said before, a big bank is estimating millions of parameters. What opportunities for gaming you have there? If you only estimate a few, then gaming is still possible, but it's reduced. And also, if it's transparent, then the central banks can check that much better. The central banks, if they would find out how UBS, for instance, calculated their value at risk, now good luck. So the answer is gaming is still possible, yes, but it's easier to be detected because the entire process is transparent. And there may be, well, a kind of evolution of mutual gaming and re-regulation and so on.
Did you want to come back on that, Sean? Or?
No, thanks for that. Yeah.
Okay, I've forgotten your name, but JMB?
Yeah, Jan from Copenhagen.
Jan.
Hi, I just want to have a question. Isn't there adaptive toolboxes something about the class of problems which more relate to self-control issues, right? Where bias is something internal. Is there anything in that could help us to solve those type of problems? Because your examples more go to a different class of problems, right?
Self-control, so to get yourself do what you think you should do?
Yes, I mean, there's one part we improve predictions, right? As we account for biases that are self-control issues, right? So intertemporal questions.
So is your question about how to use or how to develop heuristics that you can control yourself better?
If I question, is there anything like this, or does your kind of idea or your adaptive toolbox does not address that type of problem, which I think some obesity, you mentioned obesity, I think, in the paper, and I think the argument there always is the idea of intertemporal discounting, present bias, yada, yada, yada. Yeah. And my question is, do you have anything to help us in that regard or address this problem?
No, I think that most of the techniques that psychotherapists use are of the heuristic type, often setting up an environment. Now, again, when we talk about heuristic, keep in mind, they're always linked to an environment. That's very different. The dominant view in behavioral economics is still heuristics inner. It's in the mind. There's no connection. So the heuristic I'm talking about, they're all linked to the environment. And one of the things is the ways is to influence behavior to change the environment, so that certain heuristics work better. I haven't worked about self-control, but when I write a book and get really tired and and don't want to go on, then I use heuristic techniques. For instance, I allow myself to work only 2 hours per day on this book, and then when it's 1 hour and so it is gone, I suddenly get in a totally different mood. I have only 30 minutes to go, and so you can, in that self, use this kind of heuristics and see what works with you.
Thanks.
I'll ask a quick question whilst other people are thinking about questions. Actually, what I do on that usually, Gerd, is that when I'm writing something and I don't, and we all know what a toil writing can be, I always say to myself, well, nobody else is going to write this for me. Right. So that pushes me on. I'm not sure I'm giving much benefit to the world when I do that, but anyway, it gives me some self-satisfaction. Question I have for you, but Gerd, I mean, I think that you're very heavily associated with boosting as well, as along with your former PhD student Ralph Hertwig.
Yeah.
So, I think that what you've indicated, and this is what I believe as well, is that although it's very difficult to discern, for an outside person to discern, that when a person is using heuristics, that person is necessarily making mistakes in what they want to do. My view, I think, is, and I'm just saying if you agree with me, I suppose, my view is that there are organizations and interests that have become very good over the course of time in exploiting the use of heuristics, either implicitly or explicitly, usually implicitly, but sometimes explicitly. So they frame environments such that they get people to do what they want them to do. Right? So would you see a role for, once if those interests have stepped beyond the bounds of reasonability, or however you want to sense it, and that's going to be a subjective point of view, what is reasonable for these people to do and what is unreasonable for them to do. Let's just assume that we've agreed that there's some level of unreasonability that they've sort of breached. Would you openly regulate against those interests, or would you still rely upon, trying to educate the citizens or the demand side themselves to try to circumvent those manipulations? What would you do there?
So the first thing I would do is try to educate citizens. I think that's indispensable for a democracy. A democracy, if everyone is nudged, is not working. A democracy, if everyone is forced to do, is also not a democracy. So we need to invest more, and we can do that. Having said that, there are certain rules are necessary, like traffic rules. There's no question about that. But we need to find a balance between that. And this is why I have when people try to nudge, and I know many people try to nudge others, I ask myself, why don't you try first, to make people strong? Yeah.
Okay. So you always, demand-side education. Demand-side education is your main.
Yeah, and also take people seriously. So the German government has a team, a boosting team, not a nudging team, as is claimed. Three of my former postdocs are in this team, and one of them is the leader of the team. And for instance, when they try to, just to make it very short, hand washing in hospitals, big problem. Nudging solution could be put on video cameras and they feel observed and then they wash it on. But as you have probably read the studies, it has no lasting effect. Rather, doctors think they are not taken seriously. The German boosting team went into the hospitals, talked with the doctors, talked with the nurses. The nurses said the doctors are not washing their hands. The doctors said the nurses are not washing their hands. They put someone there who observes, make it empirically. Turns out, wonderfully, nobody. It's both sides' problem. Then get them together and talk with them so that they themselves develop a system. And that has, according to their has a better effect, and most important, a long-lasting effect. And these doctors and nurses think it's their own system,
autonomous,
not someone else's who wants to influence them. So that's, in an example, the difference.
That's interesting.
Take people seriously, and then they are also more reasonable.
Thanks, Gerd. Kristen, do you want to come back in again?
Yes, if that's okay. And just actually a quick comment on what you just said, Gerd, is I worked on a project in Abu Dhabi that did that with hand washing and bringing them together. And we saw a significant decrease in the rate of infections that we were targeting because it was that collaborative, not top down. My question actually is kind of almost like another side of, I think, what Malte was talking about. And that it's more to get your comments and thoughts, if you had any concerns or thoughts on this, is that if you're looking at processes, not like the financial, but probably going back to the hiring, and you have heuristics like representativeness. And I've seen this happen kind of in the real world, where individuals say, okay, I need to pick a CEO or board member or a top management individual. And they will say, okay, I've seen men from this school or these sort of top schools have been successful. And that's just something maybe consciously or unconsciously that's representative of what they've seen. So that is sort of a heuristic that they use in their selection process, while you maybe don't have enough data to compare whether that was the correct choice. And I guess I wanted to ask you this because when AI was also mentioned, we know that that kind of can sometimes facilitate or continue some of these biases just because they're historical, and that's where our data was come from, and we have social change. So I wondered your thoughts on that, and maybe this goes back to what you were saying about collecting more data, seeing and making transparency on the processes. But yes, that was.
So I do, my position is not that heuristics are always good. Contrary, I'm interested in the question: can we, by means of mathematics, proof, or if that doesn't work, by means of simulation, find out in what situation is a heuristic likely successful according to a defined criteria and where not. I just repeat it because I just feel it's often misunderstood, and people think that, say, Kahneman and Tversky would say the glass of rationality is half empty, and I would say it's half full. That's not the point. We have different conceptions of rationality, what the glass is. So this part of behavioral economics that they represent has taken over the economics view of consistency as rationality. And that's not my view. And I take another view about rationality that also has been part of economics, but of a different kind of economics, namely success in the real world. And I also try to take seriously how the human brain works. And since you mentioned representativeness, I don't know what it means. It's like availability. There are papers who show they have maybe a dozen meanings that have little to do, and also note with labels like availability or representation, you can't make any predictions, but you can explain everything that went wrong after the fact, and that's how it's usually being done. And also note that logical rationality doesn't carry you far. And framing is part of human intelligence. It can mislead us, but without framing a message, you wouldn't understand anything. So the traditional example, just to throw one in, is that a doctor tells you you have a severe heart disease and there might be an operation, but it's dangerous. So you ask your doctor. The doctor might say you have a 10% chance to die, or you have a 90% chance to survive. And according to the logical rationalities, it's the same thing, and you should not listen to the doctor. I think this is a basic misunderstanding. The doctor tells you something without saying it. And there are studies by Craig McKinsey and others who show that doctors and other people choose a frame in order to signal you. So if the doctor tells you you have a 90% chance to survive, that means do it. If the doctor tells you a 10% chance to die, be aware. And after all, this is not sufficient information. You would need, what's the chances if I don't do the surgery in the first place? All these questions are not answered. And often doctors have just experience and no statistics, or in the US, they need to do defensive medicine. So if they would tell you what to do and it goes wrong, that they're being sued. So that's what human intelligence is about. to signal, to choose terms, so that you understand on the other side, understands framing. That this can be misused by others, of course, everything. But without framing, there will be no intelligence.
Okay, I think we're going towards the end of our time. Has anybody a final question for Gerd today? I've got a final question for you, Gerd. I mean, maybe I'm being a bit provocative here, but do you and Danny Kahneman have a reasonable relationship these days, or is it still?
I have always tried to keep a good relationship with Danny. Mm-hmm. And so the short history is, you don't know whether you know. So I gave in 1988 a talk to the Stanford department, where Amos was there, and it was there are many stories about this talk.
Yeah.
And two weeks later, Danny Kahneman, who wasn't there, who was in Berkeley, then called me up and said, Gerd, you have been, I heard you gave a very successful talk in Stanford. Can I invite you to come to Berkeley? And I thought that's the right way to do.
Yeah.
And so I gave a talk at the Berkeley the psychology department, and Amos asked to have to reply on that. I said, wonderful. Yeah. It's not about people, it's about ideas.
Of course.
And then Danny invited me a second time to give a talk in Berkeley to the big cognitive science group, where all the people came to see whose blood is being shed. But that's not my view. I have certain, I have lots of open questions which I could ask here. So that started very well. I thought so, and we gave another public talk. I gave a talk, and Danny had a 10 minutes reply in the judgment decision-making time. And but then something it developed into something which at least was never my intention. People talk about rationality wars and such things. Yeah, I'm happy to discuss this issue. So, how far do we get with consistency with all this Bayesian? We get to some part is my idea. I believe in a toolbox, not in one thing. One can discuss these issues. And when Danny got his Nobel Prize, I sent him a letter to congratulate him. So from my side, I always try to keep this relationship in a way. And also, I think Ralph has managed to have as good a relationship you can have it with Danny if you disagree with him.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's... I think I always find it a bit odd when people fall out really over ideas. I mean, I thought that was the nature of scholarship, really, for us all to be together. We're not necessarily going to agree with each other. We're inevitably going to disagree with each other on.
Yeah.
But we all sort of, collectively get together and put our brains together and have, a life of mutual respect and exchange of views. I hope maybe one day I can get you and Danny in the room together again, and
I would be happy. It wouldn't be the first time.
Okay, so we need to finish here. Thank you all. Thank you so much, Gerd, for leading the discussion today, and thank you all for attending. Just a note: we've got an extra seminar within the schedule that's going to be led by Avishalom Tor. Those of you